there, and welcome to everybody to, oh, sorry, just one second. Okay, hi there, welcome to everybody to this seminar on open science organized by the Italian Reproducibility Network. I'm Cristina Zormeister from the steering committee of the network. And well, in November and December, we already had two impressive talks by Valentina Pasquale and Nicolas Coz, who respectively gave an introduction on open science and its transformative potential, and about the effectiveness of multi-lab studies. So in case you happened to miss them, or if you want to watch them again, you can find them on YouTube. If you want to find them, just go on YouTube, just type in Italian Reproducibility Network, and you'll find our channel. I also remind you that next month we have our national meeting, the national meeting of ITRN in person in Rome, and there is still a call open for that meeting. And but coming back to today's to our seminars and today's seminar, this presentation will take approximately 45 minutes, and this will followed by time for questions. And if you want to ask a question to our speaker, please tell us this in the chat. You can do two different things. If you want, you can just write the word question in the chat. In this case, we know that you want to ask a question, of course, and we will give you the floor, and then you can ask the question yourself. Please be aware, though, that we are recording the seminar, so and this will be posted online. So if you do not wish to appear in the recording, you have to switch off your camera. The second possibility is that you just write the question. You can write it in the chat. You can write it either in Italian or in English as you wish, and then we will ask the question to our speaker. Really, it's up to you how you want to ask this question. And now I'm really delighted to introduce today's speaker. Today's speaker is Rima-Maria Rahal. And she is a social psychologist at Tilburg University in Germany. She received a doctorate from Leiden University in the Netherlands. And our research focuses on decision-making, like in social and moral dilemma, how decisions are made in economic and in legal context, and all of this with a social cognition perspective, if I understand it right. And she is also interested in the topic of social science, of course, and in particular in replication studies. And this is the reason why she is going to be talking today about this issue. And I'm really welcoming you again, Rima-Maria. Thank you a lot for being here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me, Christina, and for your warm introduction. Also, I saw that there are really big footsteps to follow. I'm going to do my best to do that in the talk today, where I'll speak to you about replication and reproduction. That is the topic that you asked me to refer to. And I want to begin by saying that this kind of talk is always a bit difficult to give, because I have, in essence, no idea who's in the audience. So I know this is the Italian Reproducibility Project, the sister network to the German Reproducibility Project, where I'm a steering group member as well. But I don't know what you're working on or what you're interested in and how you do your work. For all I know, there might be some philosophical approaches, some technological approaches that I have no idea about. So that makes it a bit difficult to talk about the specifics of reproducibility and replicability. But I think despite the big differences that are probably taking place in the type of research that all of you do, probably we still have something in common. And I think that what we have in common is that we have an interest in finding out stuff about the world in your particular research area. And then basically, if you want to use this mental image that I took for you, we are all interested in clearing the fog. and finding some truth, some real effects that exist somewhere out there. But sometimes we find that it can actually be really difficult to do that, to clear the fog. And today I'll talk about one type of problem that makes it difficult to arrive at true insights about our object of investigation. And specifically, I will speak about problems with reproducibility and replicability. And to get us started, I'd like to ask you to think about this. Have you ever wanted to bake a cake? And then you look up a recipe online and it looks really good. And you think, okay, well, this is the cake I'm going to make. I'm going to follow the recipe and I'm going to get that cake, right? This is how you think it goes. But then you try to do that. You follow the recipe and your cake sometimes ends up looking more like this. Well, this, in essence, is a failure to replicate the original cake recipe. And we don't only see that with cake, but in fact, we often find such problems also with substantive research. I'm going to pick a couple of examples here from psychological research, where we can see a problem with replicability of empirical work, in that the original finding that was presented couldn't be repeated and found by other groups of researchers. I see there's a question right there, or a comment.
I'm half, it's not exactly a question, but some people told me, yeah, that the audio is not really great.
The audio is not great. So what can I do about it? Let me try to get off the
and let's see if this is any better.
I think it sounds better.
Okay, excellent.
Better.
All right, I hope that you still got the beginning of this, and I'm just going to keep going here. Thank you so much for alerting me to this. And what?
Don't worry, thank you.
All right. Okay, so I was going to pick a couple of examples of original effects that couldn't be replicated. That means that they couldn't be found again when somebody else tried to do the same study again. Perhaps one of the more better known examples of this is the power posing effect, which basically the original idea was that if you go into a power pose and do that, for instance, before you give a talk on the internet, that potentially will be recorded and lots of people are going to see. Maybe you're going to be a bit nervous about this, but doing this power pose is going to make you feel better about yourself and reduce your nervousness, your nervosity, which, you know, that seems like an easy cure, right? And something that you should absolutely do if you believe that this effect exists. But I haven't done that before my talk here today. Because actually there is some reason to doubt that this effect replicates. And even though like millions of people have seen and heard about this effect, there was a TED talk about it. It turns out there's just no merit to the original research. There are similar examples where apparently if you are primed with words that relate to the elderly, it's going to make you walk more slowly, which turned out to be not the case, but it's actually an experimental demand effect where the people who were timing how fast people were walking responded differently to the one or the other priming condition. Then there's a famous facial feedback hypothesis, which states that depending on whether you put a pen in your mouth to activate smiling or frowning muscles, you will find a comic more or less funny. And there's finally the idea that you can wash away your guilt and moral infractions if you just wash away it literally by washing your hands. Now, all of this comes kind of from my own backyard in terms of the field that I work in. I'm a social psychologist, and you know how they say when you don't have anything nice to say, at least say it about yourself. So I'm picking examples from my discipline to highlight that there are problems with the replicability of empirical work. But how big are these problems exactly? So let's look at some numbers. How replicable is social science? Is not just social science, actually. Let's look at some numbers here. So we could think of replicability as something that could exist on a continuum between 0 and 100, right? It could be either totally irreplicable, 0% replicability, or totally everything is replicable, 100. Now that's kind of unrealistic. It wouldn't be 0 or 100 because of the way that we do the statistics. So the way that we do stats means that the numbers that we could expect to happen would be somewhere between 5%, that is if all true effect sizes were 0, there's just nothing to find out, or 92% roundabout, which is if all original effect sizes were valid. So that's kind of the range that we could expect. Now, what do people actually expect? And here again, take a look at the gray numbers, just as you did before. If you ask researchers what they expect, how replicable research in their field is, we can see that psychologists who were asked in 2012 expected about half of the research of the original findings published in their literature to be replicable, meaning that they could be repeated and an effect in the same direction would be found again. That's not ideal, because that's basically saying that if you look at any paper, it's a coin toss on whether you think that this paper will replicate or not. Economists asked in the same study were a bit more optimistic about the replicability of research in their field, and they expected around about 3/4 of the original publications to be replicable. So these are just expectations. Now, what if we look at some numbers of how replicable research actually is? These are the numbers that I put in pink. In these two disciplines, we have both in terms of psychology, we have different ways of characterizing what the replication rate is. How successful is our attempts to replicate research? And this comes from the open science framework, or rather from the reproducibility project in psychology, where 100 studies were attempted to be run again, that were taken from different fields in psychology. And the findings showed that out of these 100 studies, only 36% actually yielded significant replications. Now, that's not a great number. That's even worse than what people would have expected. And we said that that was a coin toss, right? So even worse than a coin toss if you look at the actual replicability of psychological research. In behavioral economics, that's the other number in pink, things are a bit better. About 2/3 of the findings replicated here in a large-scale replication attempt, which means that the optimism of economists was somewhat justified, but perhaps still overstating a bit how good the state of their field was. And now there's an additional argument that says that only social sciences, the soft sciences in quotation marks, are supposedly affected by this issue, which is easily refuted if we take a look at some of the numbers in the hard sciences. For instance, what could be harder science than cancer research, which is undoubtedly an incredibly important area of research. But there, in a reproducibility project, the replication rates are even drastically lower, at between 11 and 25%. So in the end, basically, we are far away from the 92 that would be, not sure if, let's call it optimal. That would be the dream. Unrealistic for sure, but sort of this is where we are supposed to be. And we are rather too far away from this and too close to having to worry that a large extent of the literature that we rely on to continue with our research and to build upon is actually problematic and cannot be replicated. So now that I've painted a really bleak picture, let's at least do some definition work here and say, okay, what do I mean actually by replication? And what is the difference between replication and reproduction? Because I already mentioned this, one of the projects is called the Reproducibility Project in Psychology. But actually, I'm going to say here that I will use these terms a bit differently, just to clarify this, and then we can go forward from there. So the idea behind replication and reproducibility is that the research process should be retraceable and repeatable. And this is what gets us to the idea of replicability and reproducibility. I'm going to, for the rest of this talk, use the word reproducible and reproducibility when I mean retraceable. That just means that somebody can look at how a piece of research was performed, understand it, and therefore retrace basically the steps that were taken to arrive at a particular insight, at a particular conclusion. Doing an experiment or a study of any type, again, repeating it, that's what I mean when I say replicable. So not quite the same, slight difference, but also there's lots of argument about whether this is the right definition to use. And these terms are evolving as we go forward, but this is what I'm going to use for the rest of my talk. Okay, so given that we have these definitions, How does one do that? How can one replicate or reproduce? Well, basically, there are two different approaches we can take in terms of how broad versus shallow we want to be with our replications. So one way to go would be to single out, and that's on the right here, the deep way, to single out a specific study or a specific effect that we're interested in, and then repeatedly reassessing this individual effect. And we see lots of projects that do this, for instance, registered replication reports, or the many labs projects, which throw lots of resources at one individual question, trying to understand if this effect can be shown over multiple different laboratories, for instance, and by different research groups. The counterexample to this is a broad approach where you say, okay, we're not really interested in the specifics of one effect, but you'd rather be doing what I talked about earlier, which is to try to estimate how reproducible, how replicable is a field, an area of study, where you would assess many different studies that belong to this whatever field you're interested in. And you would, instead of running several times the same replication project, you would try to sort of scatter your resources and get a broad overview of what the state of the field is. And an example for an ongoing project here is the DARPA SCORE project, where about 300 studies are supposed to be replicated or reproduced in the end. Another example that I want to bring up is the Hagen Cumulative Science Project that takes place at Hagen University in Germany, where bachelor's and master's theses in psychology are used for replication work in the area of judgment and decision-making research. And they've managed more than 80 replications in a couple of semesters by helping basically students come up with a feasible way of replicating studies that were published in a particular journal. That journal is also very forthcoming with asking authors to share data and so on. So there was lots to go from and lots of transparency for students to work with. And therefore, they actually could make an impact to that field by creating this broad database of replications in the area. I also want to bring up the Psychological Science Accelerator, which is a meta lab, if you want, that carries out both deep and broad replication work in psychological research. There are more than 500 labs, part of this conglomerate, if you will, located in more than 70 countries, and they try to do their best to both do broad and deep work in replication and reproduction. So this way to think about replication and reproduction is one way, deep versus broad. Another way to think about it is whether to do direct or conceptual replications. I'm not saying exact replications because there's a whole lot of debate on how close to the original research you can get with an attempt to retrace or repeat an original study or an original piece of research, because there might be situational influences that make it difficult for you to get closer to what originally happened. One thing that is immediately clear is if you do something again, the time has passed since then, and there might be some effects that are actually sensitive to the time when they took place. So if you look at a piece of research from the 80s and you compare it with the way our society works now, it might be that you find quite stark differences just because of the time in which the piece of research takes place. So therefore, it's sometimes difficult to run exact replications, or it's actually sometimes impossible to do that. And instead, we use the term direct replication, trying to symbolize that this means getting as close as possible to the original and trying to emulate as much as possible the original circumstances under which a study took place. In contrast, conceptual replications make changes to the original setup and do so deliberately sometimes for reasons of practicality, sometimes for reasons of trying to explore some boundary conditions of the original effect in question. But there's another basically comparison we can make between these two types of replication and reproduction work. Either it's going to be as close as possible to the original, or it takes some leeway, which sometimes can make it difficult to assess if a reproduction or replication attempt was actually successful, shows the same result or not, because of the changes that were made. So I already mentioned that it sometimes can be difficult to get close to the original study. And if you're actually interested in how replicability and reproducibility are treated in different disciplines, because let's say when people work with qualitative data, they tend to have very different ideas of how and whether reproducibility and replicability can take place and can be meaningful and helpful for advancing research, then here's a recent publication that I've worked on that provides an overview on this problem. I'm not going to go into more detail here. I'm just going to leave this with you in case you are looking for further reading. Okay, but why do we actually need replicability and reproducibility work in the first place? So why are people concerned about these numbers? Why did I say that it's not great if the expectation of psychologists is just a coin toss on whether a certain finding will be replicable or not? Isn't it perfectly normal that not all tests can be repeated and show the same result? Well, to some degree, it is normal. If you've ever taken any medical test, then you probably know that there is always a chance that they are wrong. And even the best tests that we do have sometimes show results that are just not true. So for instance, if we take the example of a pregnancy test, although these are generally very accurate, a test that you take may show that a person is pregnant, although they really are not. And we call this type of error false positive, or it might be the other way around, and then we get a false negative showing that a person is not pregnant, although they actually are. And this example shows us that whatever we test, there's still a chance that we might be wrong, even if we try our best to be right. And if a thing that is as straightforward as peeing on a stick can get us wrong results, then something as complicated as trying to run a study about human psychological occurrences for sure is going to get us even more chances of getting something wrong. So it is possible that our observed outcomes differ from what's truly there. Now this sort of sounds dramatic, but what we can do to combat the problem of potentially detecting an effect that does not exist, or the other way around, is to simply rerun our hypothesis test. And in the pregnancy test example, this would mean just taking it as a test. And if both show us the same result, this would increase our confidence in the veracity of the conclusions that we draw. Relying on a single experiment or a single hypothesis test to draw conclusions can be risky, but considering multiple studies can increase our confidence in the conclusions that we draw from this body of research. And we're not the only ones who think it's important that an experiment or a study is replicable or reproducible. The philosophers Hempel and Oppenheim postulated that it's important for our postulates to have law-like characteristics. So this means that they need to have a long-run frequency of corroboration. And of course, always it's possible that something goes wrong, so we can accept that sometimes our effects will not show up in an experiment, and this is just how life goes. But a one-time failure to replicate or to reproduce, does that mean that our initial finding was a fluke? No. But how can we decide whether we think our effect is due to chance or due to law-like effects as we require them? The philosopher Mill has actually put forward two criteria that can help us with deciding this. Stating that first we should try to find out if there's a clear other evidence for our effect. And this is what Mill called the money in the bank criterion. And the second criterion is the criterion of a damn strange coincidence, basically suggesting that we should try to find out if the evidence for the effect that we're interested in is actually so convincing that it would be pretty weird to find this evidence was in fact not true. So in other words, Mill would also recommend that we are critical in assessing a broad evidence base for the effect that we try to test in our hypothesis test, in our experiment, in our piece of research. And by that, in essence, we can conclude that running just one piece of research is not enough. We need replication and reproducibility. So, but does this natural occurrence of errors that we just discussed actually explain this picture? Well, not really. There are actually less innocent reasons for why the replicability of empirical work is problematically low, and not just the fact that sometimes mistakes happen. In part, this problem stems from this, the way that we do research and from our practice. And in our practice, what's important is that we start to game the system in order to get ourselves some jobs and some funding and some publications that are the currency that we need in order to get the jobs and the funding. And to do that, what has been established is basically a practice of using data as rhetorical devices, and not actually of using data of any type for determining the truth or for creating solid insight. And in order to do that, of course, you know that there are a couple of things that you can do in order to make it more likely that you will find in your data what you're looking for. First, what you should do if you wanted to game the system would be to run as many small studies as possible to inflate your false discovery rate, to really benefit on this natural occurrence of errors that we just discussed. And then if you add in a couple of pieces of flexibility in your data collection, in your data analysis, and in your data reporting, so we call that p-hacking, harking, cherry picking, and peaking, then you make it much more likely that you find the results that you're looking for. Now, of course, people who game the system know that this isn't how research should be done. That's not the idea of doing research. So it's also important that then you hide your data and materials so that nobody else can repeat or retrace and replicate the work that you've done. And of course, certainly you should never try to run it yourself again. So in essence, this practice is part of the reason why the reproducibility and replicability crisis has escalated to such a degree where we find such low reproducibility and replicability rates across the board in research. And I want to move on now to talk about two sides of what we need to do to change our practice to actually get to a better picture and move away from this practice and this idea of using data as rhetorical devices. So the need to change our practice, to my mind, has two parts. There are two sides to the issue of replication and reproducible work, and here are what I think they are. On the one hand, I think that preparing your research to be reproducible and replicable is a duty for us as researchers. That doesn't mean that you have the duty to ensure that your findings are irrefutable. It means that you have to prepare the work that you put out there so that others have the opportunity to refute it. So basically our work, mine as well, not just you, our work needs to be set up in a way that enables our peers to understand it and that enables them to retrace our conclusions and to put them to the test. Otherwise, what we are doing, in essence, isn't really research. It would just be telling ourselves stories about the world that actually lack a robust basis. And that, at least in my book, is not research. Research means that we put our conclusions to the test. And it's not just our own test, but others can test it as well. So this is the one side, I think. And the other side, I think that somebody needs to do the work to retrace and repeat original research. And that task is sometimes seen as actually less appealing than doing original research. And we sort of follow a bit of an outdated cult of genius, where all that matters is who came up with it first, not even if it was right the first time, just that somebody did it first. But given what we've discussed, I think it's absolutely necessary to do research work on replication and reproduction because we need it for research progress. So it's time that we change how we think about this work and also how we evaluate it, because it actually has a couple of clear benefits if this work is done, in addition to creating progress in research. First, it means that somebody cares about the original research. So I've decided for myself that if ever anybody tried to run a replication on one of my studies, I would be just delighted, because this means that somebody cares so much about the work that I've done that they put in the additional brain power to try to corroborate it. That would be fantastic. And I think taking this attitude would be helpful if we could do this as a field. I think that reproducibility and replication are helpful because they provide legitimate learning opportunities. For instance, for students who get an overview of how the work in their field is done. And I mean the nitty-gritty details of how the work in the field is done. In replication and reproduction work, this is basically training on the job and learning exactly how a piece of research came into being, and retracing these steps and trying to do them again is going to be such a helpful step towards joining in that field and getting started in that field. And at the same time, doing replication and reproduction work is an actually important contribution to the field because it helps corroborate the robustness of our shared body of knowledge. And it means an opportunity to share our brainpower for our shared effort to learn stuff about this world. So as such, I think that reproducibility and reproduction work and replicability are some of the building blocks of solid insight. And they are but two of the building blocks that we need in order to get to the point where those insights and the conclusions that we draw are actually based on a solid basis. It also, I think, requires all of these other blocks. And after all, if we stay particularly with the example of reproducibility and replicability, you cannot reproduce without proper documentation and data availability. So if you want another mental picture, basically, for this brick wall that I've set up here, think of an iceberg. An iceberg and reproducibility and replicability are really just the tip of the problem and require fixing what's going on under the waterline to improve how we gather insights about the world. And for that, we're going to need things like open data, usable data with a code book and all. And we need usable code to be able to retrace and redo analysis and so on. But talking about the rest of this solid basis, that's really a matter for a much longer talk. So I'm going to not do that. Instead of diving into that, I'll just leave you with two more pieces of my work that you can check out, both dealing with this idea of building solid basis for insight. One is an online course about generating insight, and the other is a written summary of why we need open science as a reform movement to change the game of how research is done. And with that, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity today to talk about two building blocks of positive change for research, tackling reproducibility and replicability. And I'll be happy to do a Q&A with more practical advice if you have any trouble that you run into with regard to doing reproducibility work or replicability work. And I look forward to a discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Rima-Maria. Sorry, I keep looking on another screen, but it's because I have to. Okay, thank you for your talk. It was really, really interesting. And I would move to the questions right away. If anybody has questions, again, I'll just post it again, but basically you can raise your hand and we will let you speak, or you can write your question in the chat, or you can write it directly to me if you do not want it in the chat for some reason, and I will read it out. I'm Benedica. Well, you can see my name on the screen. So okay. We'll start with Christina right away, I think, so she can break the ice for us.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you. It was actually what I expected. So I have really great presentation, very interesting, very clear. I was in particular interested about about many things that you said, but one in particular, you said that we need to replicate more our work, and to do this, one thing that we have to do is to change how the work is evaluated, how replications are evaluated. So do you have in mind something specific regarding this? What should we do to change the work, to change the way replication work is evaluated?
Yeah, thank you so much, Christina. I think you put the finger on a really sore point for me, because I've been thinking about this quite a bunch in the past, a couple of months. And I think it's basically an issue to come from two directions. On the one hand, it needs to be easier to publish replication work in the journals that we have. So given that this is the system we have, I think it should be easier to do that. And there are a couple of steps that have already been taken. One of them is the concept of registered replication reports, which several journals now accept as an outlet for replication work. And it's a bit of a different review process, actually, which is quite cool. So you write a proposal of a replication project that you want to do. You send that proposal to the journal, and there will be a review process at this point. And this means that the idea to replicate is being reviewed and not the actual outcome. So your publication won't depend on whether you corroborate the original finding or not. This has been a problem in the past because unsuccessful replication attempts, they just landed in what we call a file drawer. So basically, they never ended up being published and they just landed in the trash. Instead, this format makes it possible for critical research work to be done without having this fear of not being able to publish this work. So I think this is one important step. But I think on the other hand, it's not just where we can publish, but also how these publications are going to be received. And I think there we need some institutional changes in the hiring committees and in the evaluations that researchers go through. It's a bit country dependent on how exactly this works. But I can tell you an example, which is that I know in Germany, bonus systems exist for researchers. And if you have a top tier publication, you get this certain bonus at the end of the year. And sometimes what happens is that if you are on a replication project with, let's say, they tend to be large, especially if you have these many labs projects, they can be something like 200 co-authors. This somehow doesn't count as a proper publication. And that's just not okay, because this is research work. You are a co-author. This means that somebody thought it was acceptable to give you that status based on the work that you've done. And yet still institutions will say that this is somehow not comparable to an original piece of research. And I think this is an example of where some change is needed. In the way that institutions evaluate reproduction and replicability work that is actually being done. So to summarize, I think it's a two-pronged approach that we need to take. First, make it easier to create outlets for these projects. And on the other hand, increase the evaluations that we have of them in the way that we hire, we promote, we also give grants, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. I think there will be, I hope it looks like there's some change in this direction, some small change. So personally, I hope we're going to see more and more change. And now I think Carlo raised his hand.
Yeah, thank you, Rima-Maria, for your very nice talk. I have a question on the same line. So the main problem is motivation. And you raised an important aspect related to how we how the system evaluate our work. But do you see any other way to go? Like, can you see any way to increase motivation without changing the system? So we do need to change the system, but that will take quite a lot. So I'm wondering if there's any way to increase motivation much earlier than being able to change the system.
Yeah, thank you, Carlo, for bringing this up. Of course, systematic change, that just takes a while. I agree with that. Even so, I think there are two types of people who do work in replication and reproduction at the moment. On the one hand, it's the idealists who think like, we should do this. This is how research should be done. So no matter the consequences, I'm going to do it. But on the other hand, I also think that there are some sort of selfish reasons for doing replication work and reproduction work that kind of fit in the current regime, in the current way that we do in our current practice as a discipline, if we talk about psychology or as academia more generally. So without having to do a revolution, I think it can still pay to do work for replication and reproduction projects because these tend to be heavily cited. So if you are looking for a boost in your H-index with all the flaws that this can produce, a replication or reproduction project can actually be helpful. So if I look at my Google Scholar page, I think it gives me a ridiculous amount of citations for being a co-author in the original science publication that was the reproducibility project in psychology. And this is not only the case for like this one paper, but also others that go along similar lines tend to have a big impact on the field because there's continued discussion, because if basically anybody working on a certain area wants to do a literature review, this is a good place to start. So it would be kind of similar advice to saying, you know, you should do a meta-analysis or you should do a review paper to sort of get a grip on the field. You might as well try to do a replication or reproduction attempt because sort of from this perspective of I need to kind of survive in this world of publish or perish where my H-index matters, then this is the argument, I would say.
Thank you. Yeah, we use the same mechanism that the system is actually using, but we should also promote this kind of mechanism much more.
Okay. I do have a question myself, but if there's someone from our audience, especially PhD students, who wants to ask something, I'd let them go first. Otherwise, on a slightly different note, since you spent some time differentiating between replicability and reproducibility, lately okay. Do you think they have the two kind of processes should have or do have a different role? So trying to replicate the results of a study on different data rather than trying to exactly reproduce the steps and see if we come up with the same results. I see them as as tackling two different issues in a way. I wanted to know what you think about it.
Well, I think they go very much in the same direction, which is why I sort of mushed the two together for this talk. I think the big difference is whether you are interested in creating new data, or whether you think that the use of the original data, and here data could really mean anything. This also works for the qualitative sciences. Whether the use of the original data is going to be enough to help you understand if you buy it, if you believe the conclusion. And in that sense, I think that is the big difference. And otherwise, I would say that the two are very much related and go in a similar direction, namely to try to detect if a conclusion is based on a solid piece of research and is a solid insight. But of course I'm curious, Federica, what is your opinion on the matter? Like, what do you think is the big difference between the two? And
coming from being a bit more anxious and insecure about my own analysis, I tend to see like the attempt to exactly replicate someone else's study as more a way of figuring out if there was any flaws in the statistical analysis, for instance. So like putting more weight on the original researchers. And a replication would be, I don't know, different.
I guess I'm not sure I agree, because I think that also for both a replication and a reproduction attempt, it is going to be the case that somebody will look at the code if it's available of the original research. And I know of several examples where there was actually an error in the coding, and then it so happened that the original research actually should have come to a different conclusion, and that occurred both with replication and reproduction attempts. So I do think that the two are still geared at the same thing, but I do understand that perhaps maybe we should add one additional word to kind of the thesaurus we've been building across this little talk, which is the concept of computational reproducibility, which basically just says that somebody is going to double check that the analysis you've run are actually that they make sense, and that you didn't have like an innocent coding error somewhere, which I think is perhaps a bit of a different kind of concept. So I think reproducibility as a concept as a whole is more than just somebody checking your code. It's also about understanding how the design was set up, and whether the way that design was set up actually allows for the conclusions and so on. So I would say that the umbrella term of reproducibility to me is just larger than simply this slight worry that I'm sure we all have, that we have a rounding error somewhere, and this makes a huge problem for all of our conclusions. So I understand what you mean, but I think I still disagree to some degree.
Thank you. No, it does make a lot of sense. Just sometimes there's still this little bit of anxiety in a way about checking and being checked. It's cool to do it, but I think that's one of I know when I first heard, or when I took my first steps into open science matters, this was a little bit of one. This was a bit of a.
I totally feel that
for me,
because nobody likes to be wrong, right? That always feels bad, and especially in a sort of in a profession that is as ours, because as researchers, it's kind of our job to be right. And then if you are wrong about something, or you make a mistake, it actually feels really bad. But I think it would also be time for a bit of a culture change in that regard. I make all of my research openly available in terms of data analysis and so on. And I would just love it if somebody went there and took a look at my code and actually helped me to find an error if there was one, because I think that would just make the research better. So I'm doing the best that I can, but I also know that I write 600 lines of code for a simple analysis, and nobody is going to check it, which makes me a bit sad. And I wish that the way that we dealt with errors was different, because of course in those 600 lines of code I made a couple of mistakes, and I tried to find and fix them, but I'm not sure if I got them all. So if we had a different error culture, and one where it's okay to make mistakes, and it's fantastic and helpful to point them out to others, I think that would really benefit the way that we do research.
Thank you. And I think that talking about it the way you are and hearing more people talk about it is one of the things that helps the most. I see one question from Laura. If you would like to just open your microphone and ask your question, go ahead.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks for the very interesting talk. So I was wondering what you think about the following question that I always have, which is, when you embark in a replication project, do you think the best option is to also involve the original authors of the work you want to replicate? Because on the one hand, I see that, you maybe want to have a team that is completely independent from the original team, but on the other hand, also, following up on what you were discussing about, the fear of being checked, etc. It would be a more positive approach maybe to say, hey, let's collaborate on this, and not because you're bad and I'm good, but because we all want to do better work maybe, or we all want to find out whether this interesting effect can be replicated. And so I think it would create a more positive atmosphere also in the research, in research in general. So what's your take on this?
Yeah, so thank you for bringing this up. I actually think it's a super important question, and it boils down to the kind of philosophy you have about how research should be done. And I actually think it should be a collaborative thing. So I think it would be just the nice and collaborative and pro-social thing to do, to tell the people whose work you're going to replicate that you're going to replicate it. And so I think this is, first of all, just a kind thing to do. But then second, I think it's also going to be useful, because if the original authors still have a piece of information that you are actually lacking, you might need that. And if you start from a basis that is like friendly and kind, then they're going to be much more likely to be forthcoming with this. And it could be something like a missing file that you need in order to be able to actually do your replication, or it could be basically checking whether you actually understood correctly what they were trying to do and how they were trying to do it, and having this conversation. Somebody, you need a partner for that conversation. So in essence, I would say it's nearly always the case that it's at least you should contact the people whose work you're going to replicate. Whether they should be involved in the replication itself, that is a different question. So there's this concept of sort of adversarial collaboration, where people who have different opinions about a hypothesis work together to see like which way it goes. So this could be a thing, or you could decide to try to be completely independent of the original authors in the way that you set up and run your study. Both has advantages and drawbacks, and it really depends on what you're trying to do. But that doesn't, like I said, I think at minimum you should always just say, hey, we're going to go replicate your work, and keep this sort of in a friendly, approachable, collaborative manner. Yeah, I think that would be my answer to that question. I don't know. Is that helpful?
Yes, thanks. I was really also wondering about involving people in the publication, like as co-authors. But I think you were also addressing this. Yeah.
I mean, given that our publications are kind of the currency that we as researchers use to get jobs and get grants and so on, I think this would again be a kind thing to do, to involve the original researchers in the replication attempt, if you foresee that this can be fruitful. And sometimes it might not be, because let's say the ideas that people have about the original researchers is too different. But why not? I think it nearly never costs you anything to have just one more co-author, and you can just give credit where credit is due if somebody is actually meaningfully contributing to the work that you're doing, for instance, by giving you access to additional materials and thoughts and thought processes that they had before running their study. Then why shouldn't they be a co-author? So I guess this is again a question of how you think our practice should be as researchers in academia, and I think it should be one where you give credit where it's due.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot again, Rima-Maria and Laura. If we don't have any other questions that come up, I will pass the word to Christina.
If there is other people, I mean, I'm happy to. But I mean, it's really so exciting, this topic, that I have so many questions. But I was thinking also, while you were talking about this, I was thinking about one discussion that was on Twitter a few weeks ago regarding the replication of one's own work before publishing. So the idea, I think it was put forward by Daniel Lakens, that before you publish, it's better that you replicate your study. This was basically for statistical reasons, because if you get the first study is significant, the second one is significant, the probability of being wrong is definitely very, very low. And I was thinking of regarding this, that there are basically two dimensions that are kind of orthogonal. One is whether you replicate your own studies or your own work, or other people do replicate it, and whether it is a direct or a conceptual replication. No. And so I was thinking, first of all, if you would agree with the position that was put forward, that before you publish, you do, well, you should replicate your work to be more confident. And the second thing, if in this case you think it's more appropriate to do an exact replication or like a conceptual replication, like what I typically do is doing a conceptual replication in which like I change the dependent measure, but I measure the same thing in a slightly different way. But I'm not sure if it is really the best option or if there are reasons why a direct one should be the best one if you are replicating your own work before publishing it, before trying.
Okay, I see. So basically 2 parts of the question. The first part is, should you do kind of auto replications of your own work? And I think the answer is yes, it always helps to replicate. I think that's a good thing to do. But I think we should also be mindful of the additional burden that this places on the individual researcher. So if I have to rerun my study, my own study, this means I need twice as much money to pay my participants. I need twice as much time and so on and so forth. So in essence, what this means is that it's going to become more costly for me to produce some research. I think that's okay, and it should be, because you know, you're just making sure that the research that you're publishing is actually more robust. But again, I think we need some institutional change to actually make that possible, because eventually this is going to be probably within the same publication. So this means now you've kind of wasted two money for 2 studies on 1 publication, while otherwise you could have done 2 publications with that money. I think it's better to have 1 good publication that's sort of qualitatively good in terms of including research that's actually corroborated, but the way that our current incentive system is set up is just simply not supporting that. So while I agree with Daniel's assessment that we should be doing auto replications, I also think that we should be creating the sort of the system around academia that actually makes this possible. So that's the first part of your question. The second part, if I got it right, is if you do your replications of your own work, how should you do it? And you said that you tend to do it more in kind of a conceptual way, where you sort of change something slight. And the issue with that is that if the original finding doesn't show up again, you don't know why. So you don't know if it's because the original research doesn't replicate, or if it's because of this small thing that you changed and somehow this created, you know, chaos-wise, this created a huge ripple effect, and then your finding is gone. I would say it's actually okay to make this little change, because if your finding isn't robust enough to withstand such small changes in, let's say, the way that you measure your response variable, whatever, then it's probably not robust and not interesting-ish, or not as interesting as it would be if it was, you know, generalizable to that degree. So I would say, or this is also how I've done it, that it's fair and okay to make some changes and to go for rather conceptual replication compared to a direct one. But I've also gotten into the trouble that I've just described, where there was just something that happened and I didn't know why it didn't replicate anymore. So you have to go into it with open eyes and just be prepared for potentially having to write a more complicated paper than you would otherwise. Because basically these auto replications and the things that can go wrong and that can go right, they make it more difficult for you to tell a smashing story that sounds like a publication in Science is just waiting. And this is, if I may, another problem that we have with the way that we publish research. It has to be like a clear-cut, easy story to tell, and most evidence just isn't that. If we're honest, then do you remember the piece of cake that I showed in the beginning of my talk? Well, it's usually not the shiny cake that actually occurs in our research. And maybe it's not as messy as the other one that I showed, but there's always some degree of mess, and it's not often the case that our findings or insights are that clear-cut. So if we put some more realism in the way that we read research, that we publish research, I think that would be fantastic. We should just, all of us, we should just do it and write papers about the real stuff that we find.
Thank you a lot. I don't know if there are any other questions. Otherwise, I would thank you again Rima-Maria. It was really, well, I think that it was very interesting for me, and I hope, I'm pretty sure actually, that it was very useful. It has been very useful for the students that were listening today and for all of us. And so thank you again a lot. And now some general information for especially for the students, but for all people that are here with us today. We will, for those who have asked it, we will send you an email certifying the participation in approximately a week, as usual. And we will post the recording on YouTube again in 1 week or 2 weeks, and other things. Next month, the 18th of February, we will have Erik-Jan Wagenmakers of the University of Amsterdam, who will be talking about best practices and transparency in statistics. And finally, the 24th of February, we will have, I already mentioned it in the beginning, but I want to stress it again. We'll have the national meeting in Rome. I hope to see some of you at least, hopefully all of you in Rome in person. And I'm thinking probably this is, that's it for today, right? I'm not forgetting anything important, I hope. Thank you all, and see you soon.